Hello, my name is Becky Graves. I'm a master's student at the University of Winchester studying animal welfare, behaviour, ethics and law, and today I will be giving a presentation on welfare considerations for kennelled dogs. Despite the human-animal bond that has developed with dogs since their domestication 17,000 years ago, and 27% of the adult population in the UK being dog owners, the welfare of kennel dogs is an area that has not kept pace with advances in animal welfare science and welfare standards in other non-human animal populations. During this presentation, I aim to articulate why the welfare of kennelled dogs deserves consideration, provide an overview of current legislation and guidance and highlight the gaps that are present in that legislation, evaluate current methods for assessing kennelled dog welfare, evaluate current recommendations for best practice in their implementation, and finally, I will suggest what could be done to improve the welfare of kennelled dogs. So why is the welfare of kennelled dogs important? There are several populations of dogs that can be considered as kennelled. These are working dogs, shelter dogs, sporting dogs, dogs temporarily housed in boarding kennels, and dogs used in animal research. Estimating the number of kennelled dogs in the UK is somewhat harder than identifying populations. Accurate numbers of police, customs and military working dogs are not typically available, and the number of shelter dogs can fluctuate. But trends are identifiable, and figures from the RSPCA show that rehoming has dropped 8%, whilst animal intake is up 8.4% year on year. At the same time, the average stay for dogs also increased from 85 days in 2020 to 93 days in 2021. This means that more dogs are spending longer in kennels waiting to find a home. Numbers of dogs in more closely monitored populations are more readily available. Understanding Animal Research cites that in 2020 there were 4,340 experimental procedures carried out on dogs, but that the number of dogs used was slightly less. And the RSPCA reported that in 2021 there were in excess of 18,000 licensed greyhounds eligible to race in the UK. So there is a large and diverse population of kennelled dogs in the UK, and the difficulty in accounting for them is an early indication that their welfare may be overlooked. So what welfare challenges does the kennelled environment present? Dogs are naturally inquisitive social animals that enjoy space to exercise. Kennels are normally designed to provide a facility that is easy to clean and house many dogs securely in a limited space. This means that they are often small and barren spaces that isolate individual dogs and provide little to support their behavioural needs, such as social contact, control over their environment and adequate exercise. The social as well as the physical environment also challenges dogs. Changes and uncertainty in routine and turnover of kennel staff can cause kennelled dogs separated from their familiar caregivers to exhibit separation anxiety disorders. So the kennelled environment is a very unnatural environment for a dog that prevents physical, social and behavioural challenges. So what are the effects of these welfare challenges? Physiological evidence supports the assertion that dogs experience stress in a kennelled environment, and research has shown that many find kennel life challenging and experience poor or compromised welfare as a result. Although the kennelled environment guards against survival critical negative effects, very few are designed to mitigate against situation-related negative effects, such as frustration, loneliness, boredom and anxiety, which, as in other animals, can result in abnormal behaviour and, over time, compromised immune function. There are also some specific second-order effects for kennelled dogs. For example, work by Rooney and Gaines on the welfare of working dogs consistently demonstrates that a happy dog makes a good worker. Long-term stress can lead to a reduced ability to learn, and poor welfare can lead to ill health and therefore reduced ability to work. In addition, transition to kennels can be particularly stressful. Research using working dogs has found that for those neither bred nor raised in kennels, their transition is especially stressful. The stress associated with a transition to kennels can also affect dogs in rehoming centres. Many owners prefer to adopt dogs who interact positively with them at the shelter, so the likelihood of a dog exhibiting abnormal behaviour will affect the dog's chances of being successfully rehomed. So due to the diversity in kennel dog populations, the effect of poor welfare extends beyond basic physiological and behavioural effects to impact on the very purpose they are kept in kennels to start with. So how does this population compare to other species subject to intensive husbandry practices? The kennel dog population is generally more diverse than other intensively housed species. They are often expected to rapidly adapt to this new and challenging environment, and additionally, many dogs are expected to perform working and sporting roles whilst in kennels. To understand why there can be kennel populations that are unaccounted for, we must look at current legislation and guidance related to kennel dogs. The two pieces of legislation that provide legal provision in England are the Animal Welfare Act 2006, specifically Section 9, and the Animal Welfare Licensing of Activities Involving Animals England Regulations 2018. The Animal Welfare Act, Section 9, states that a person commits an offence if he does not take such steps as are reasonable in all the circumstances to ensure that the needs of an animal for which he is responsible are met to the extent required by good practice. This is a broad piece of legislation designed to cover all sentient non-human animals. It relies on there being agreed and recognised standards for good practice, as well as accepted standards for suitable environments, and an understanding of what constitutes normal behaviour. As we will see when we look at the welfare assessment of kennel dogs, these are not necessarily in place, leaving potential for this legislation to be difficult to enforce. Animal Welfare Licensing of Activities Involving Animals England Regulations 2018 sets out the duties of local authorities in England to licence activities involving animals and the relevant establishments relating to this. They replace several older pieces of legislation, but of note, they specifically exclude military, police and sporting animals, and they also do not cover shelter animals as they are designed to legislate businesses, so therefore exclude not-for-profit organisations. These regulations do put animal welfare and consideration of the 5 welfare needs at the centre of the licensing regime and are a significant improvement on the legislation they replaced, but they still fail to capture some of the most significant kennel dog populations, and it could be argued that they remain basic with a focus on needs in the physical environment with little provision for positive stimuli, stress reduction and requirements for social interactions. In addition to the legislation, there are also several codes of practice and guidance documents available. The DEFRA Code of Practice for the Welfare of Dogs is applicable to all dogs, and although a breach of the provision of this code is not an offence itself, if proceedings can be brought under Section 9 of the Animal Welfare Act. So this does provide some additional provision for the populations excluded by the Licensing of Activities Involving Animals regulations. The Greyhound Board of Great Britain has also recently published publicly available Specification 251/2017, which provides specifications for greyhound trainers' residential kennels and makes provision for independent inspections, a significant improvement to the very basic provisions in existing licensing standards. But these supporting codes and guides still do not plug the gap in legislation, leaving populations unregulated and only covered by the Animal Welfare Act. Critically, without specific regulations to cover kennel standards, funding for improvement can be hard to justify and obtain in larger government organisations, and many well-meaning but underfunded and increasingly overcrowded rehoming organisations can also continue to operate unregulated. The gap in legislation is particularly surprising when compared with legislation, codes and guidance provided for farm animals. Of course, in areas such as animal welfare, legislation and guidance can only be as strong as the evidence base that underpins it. The assessment of kennel dog welfare is an area that lacks consensus, standardised protocols, and still focuses on negative welfare states and needs. Existing legislation tends to focus on the physical environment and management practices to measure welfare. Although measuring management practices as indicators of welfare is simpler than attempting to discern well-being from animal-based measures, they only give an indication of an animal's potential for good welfare. So animal-based measures are still needed for a full assessment, and this remains an emerging area of research. Work on the identification of behaviours that indicate a negative welfare state is well documented. These behaviours can include pacing, wall bouncing, tail chasing, spinning, hiding, listlessness and excessive vocalization. Prevalence of these behaviours has also been seen to change over time. Certain behaviours decrease, such as a lack of appetite and fear-associated behaviours, but the proportion of dogs observed to pace repetitively and wall bounce increases. It is also thought that dogs exhibiting repetitive behaviour in the absence of high arousal events, such as feeding, may be experiencing chronic stress. There has been considerably less investigation into the signs of good welfare, but they are thought to include playful behaviour, active exploration of the environment, friendly social interactions with other dogs and people, and resting. Physical signs of poor welfare can include weight loss, areas of self-mutilation or excessive grooming, and worn or sore pads. As with behavioural indicators, there is considerably less research that focuses on physical signs of good welfare, but body and muscle condition scoring and assessment of the general signs of good health can be used. Physiological methods that can be used to assess welfare in kennel dogs include cortisol levels, heart rate, temperature, analysis of antibody and white blood cell levels to measure immune function, and fecal consistency. But in a review of these measures, Polgar et al. Found that few had clear valence and more research was needed to validate nearly all of them. Attempts have been made to create evidence-based welfare assessment tools specifically for rehoming centre dogs. Barnard et al. Developed the Shelter Quality Protocol, which uses 26 indicators of welfare, including management, resource, and animal-based measures. And Kiddy and Collins developed a quality of life assessment tool based on behavioural indicators of both positive and negative emotional states. In addition, Bauer et al. Developed the Field Instantaneous Dog Observation Tool, or FIDO, as a non-invasive, field-ready tool designed to capture the immediate observable physical and behavioural status of dogs in breeding kennels. This was subsequently evaluated by Mugenda et al., who found the behaviour component to be reliable even when used by novices, but suggested that further research was needed to validate scores obtained using the tool against other indicators of immediate welfare state and against long-term indicators of overall welfare. So whilst indicators of poor welfare are generally well understood and individual organisations tend to have their own welfare assessment procedures, there is no consensus on what measures should be included in these assessments, nor on the validity of those measures. In addition, evidence-based welfare assessment tools have been aimed at rehoming centre dogs, or in Fido's case, dogs in breeding facilities. As such, there is again a gap when it comes to working and sporting dogs. And as with the legislation and guidance, this area is some way behind progress that has been made in welfare assessment of farm animals, where a number of standardised and industry-recognised methods are available. Despite some gaps in research underpinning welfare assessment in kennel dogs, a number of studies do make recommendations to improve kennel welfare. The first of these is a gradual introduction to a kennel environment. Noted in research by Rooney and Gaines with specific reference to working dogs, it is worth noting that it is rarely possible for dogs taken into rehoming shelters. In a comprehensive review of the effect of the kennel environment on canine welfare, Taylor and Mills grouped housing requirements into physical, social, sensory, occupational, nutritional, and psychological environments. In the physical environment, they noted the benefits of space, outdoor access, kennel furniture including raised platforms, choices of places to rest, and bedding for warmth. Recommendations for the social environment included the need for intraspecific and interspecific contact. This is reinforced by Rooney et al. And Cobb et al., who both note the benefit of daily positive interactions, group walks, group free run sessions, pair housing if carefully chosen, and increased contact with handlers and caretakers. Taylor and Mills note that in the sensory environment, visual has received little scientific attention, but lack of visual contact with other dogs and humans has been listed as a source of kennel stress. Olfaction is a very important sense in dogs, but current recommendations focus on the addition of aromas such as lavender, rather than elimination of potentially noxious ones such as disinfectant. And studies on auditory stimulation have found that when classical music is played, dogs spend more time resting and less time barking and standing, but again, very few studies have focused on the potential effects of overstimulation. Research looking at the occupational environment focuses on the addition of items such as toys to encourage foraging and exploration, but regular exercise is generally thought to be more beneficial. In the nutritional environment, a high-quality diet has been found to reduce ACTH levels, and chew toys and anti-gulp bowls can be used to provide a more mentally stimulating feeding experience. Finally, in the psychological environment, control and predictability is thought to be most important, and in tandem with the social environment, husbandry regimes and, in particular, the level of contact with people may be as important, if not more so, than the physical kennel environment. Unfortunately, despite this body of research, legislation and protocols still focus on physical environment and do not put enough emphasis on the social, sensory and psychological environments. Perhaps most importantly, a recent paper by Cobb et al. Published in 2020 found that despite research into practices that can reduce stress in a kennelled environment, these were rated as the most unimportant kennel management practices, which demonstrates that research is not being translated into evidence-based changes in industry practice. So what could be done to improve kennelled dog welfare? Firstly, the effect of the kennelled environment on dogs needs to be more fully understood and include a greater focus on positive signs of welfare and normal behaviour. A method or methods for assessing their welfare should then be more extensively validated and agreed. This would enable the production of industry-wide standards, which could incorporate current and emerging welfare recommendations and more effectively underpin legislation and codes of practice. This legislation and codes of practice should seek to incorporate those populations not currently covered, particularly rehoming shelters and sporting dogs. Ideally, there should be enforceable standards that are applicable to all populations of kennelled dogs. In addition, improved promotion of research findings and practical suggestions for their implementation into husbandry regimes would enable change to be enacted more quickly, particularly for non-structural recommendations such as increasing levels of exercise and time with care workers or handlers.